friends, I am Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, and today I'm here to talk about a role-playing game that I don't feel gets as much attention as it should, despite the fact that it still remains as one of the more popular role-playing games that's ever existed. It doesn't have the lineage, perhaps, that Dungeons & Dragons does, but it's certainly been around for quite a long time and has accumulated a lot of acclaim over its years, and also a lot of scorn from the gaming community for a variety of reasons. Its premise is, well, a little tricky to come to grips with. It is a science fantasy game, more than anything else, I think is the fairest description of it. And quite honestly, I think that it came out in a time period when there was a lot of things just going in all different directions, and this is one that's kind of staked its own little niche, so it pounced on gathering trends, made an interesting fusion, and was well supported, even though it's changed hands a few times. So, as of right now, we're going to talk about Shadowrun. This is by request. I had in one of the comments, somebody mentioned that I think it was the werewolf game, they said, are you ever going to talk about Shadowrun? And absolutely, I'll talk about Shadowrun all day and all night. But for the purposes of this, we're going to keep it fairly brief. For those of you who don't know what Shadowrun is, this was the first edition of Shadowrun right here. This iconic image. And this is, as I said, science fantasy. It's a possible future, and as we're getting closer and closer, not that far in the future, obviously things have changed. But this came out in 1989. I got a hold of it in 89. I got 93 or 94. So, when I was in college, I got this game. Why did I get this? Well, first of all, the cover just drew me in. You see here, there is an elven ears. Decker, he is slicing into a computer. You have a woman, very, she's quite pretty. She's got her hand encased in magical energy and a shotgun in the other. And then you have a guy with a pair of twin, look like Uzis, firing away at some folks who are taking cover behind a car. And he has a very unusual hair and face paint and otherwise wearing street fighting clothes. So, and they're surrounded as if they were in this canyon of all these immense buildings with their lights and, Shadowrun. And for some reason, Shadowrun, even though it's technological, you still got this odd skull that's always kind of been front and center in the logos. So there's a lot of weird things going on here, but exciting and enticing. What Shadowrun really is it is a dystopian future science fantasy. And in that, there is cyber technology is a thing. Is it cyberpunk? Not exactly. Cyber technology is, of course, a core tenet. You can do all kinds of body modifications to make yourself better in a lot of ways. Will we have anything like that in the year 2050? Honestly, the way technology is ever escalating farther and farther, some of this stuff might actually come to pass. But it's unrealistic that we'll have somebody have complete, spinal, wired reflexes and things like that. Some of the upgrades they're doing right now with enhanced vision, helping people who are blind to get their sight back. Theoretically, the next step might be some sort of cyber vision, and we're already seeing amazing things done with cameras and the like. Who knows? It's some fascinating stuff to think about. But the impetus for a lot of why that world is different from ours stems back to an Earth that gets ravaged a couple of times. A couple of things. Number one, there was a huge plague. Not necessarily a good thing. Nastier than the coronavirus, if you can imagine that. Did a lot of damage. Then something called goblinization happened, where people just started changing. And they would form into what looked like fantasy creatures of old. Some people turned to dwarves, and they were short and stocky and healthy in constitution, but, stubby toes and short. Some were elves, and they grew graceful and tall with the pointed ears and Then you had some that turned into orcs, who were taller on average than the humans. They could grow little horns and the like, but they were mostly stronger and more durable. And then you had trolls. Trolls were the hardest to miss because they grew up to over 8 feet tall. And while we do occasionally see a person who's, 7 feet tall or something like that among us, they stand out. Now imagine if they were that big, but they had horns and bones kind of growing out, and they were just as powerful as they looked. Usually people who are really tall often, unfortunately, have a string of physical handicaps. It's not healthy for people to be that tall, and they often have difficulty walking and things by the time they've reached even middle age. Trolls have the body strength and durability to absorb their size, which makes them extremely powerful. Well, you can imagine how reasonable humanity is that they would have accepted these people among their midst without any... No, they flipped out. There were near genocides. People were trying to react in the worst way sometimes. More reasonable heads came out and said, hey, there's still people in there. They're just different. And then babies started being born with these traits as well, and it just seemed so random, and humanity was caught off guard. A lot of bad things happened. And then, magic. And the way it came about was really strange again. They're very specific on this, because magic first came, by all appearances, to the Native Americans of the United States. The first major magical event, if I remember my history right, was a man called Daniel Howling Coyote, who led this great ghost dance, which basically kicked the butts of the United States government. And he stepped forward as the prophet of the Native American nations and said, get out of our land. And the United States was like, no. And they're like, you're going to suffer if you don't. And then magical retribution. Eventually the United States had to say, okay, you can have your lands back. We'll pull out. Do this. And the world changed. Magic popped up all over the place. People started to be able to reproduce magical effects to the point where there's actually a science based around magic. So MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, became Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Magic. MIT? I don't remember. But, it was able to be studied, it was able to be replicated, and you needed to have a gift for it. You needed to have the magical attribute. And then you could manipulate magic. It could kill you. If you pushed it too far, you'd learn too powerful of a spell, but it could be studied, it could be broken down, it could be taught. Very important. But that wasn't the only way magic worked either. There was really strange stuff. Some people were shamans, and they started to see spirits all around them. And they started to serve a particular spirit as their totem. And that would give them magical abilities. In some cases, the match of these mages who were learning their magic, the shamans, were able to also pull off interesting magic, but often in different ways. It maintained a little bit of separation, even though mechanics were effectively the same. Kind of the same way that Dungeons & Dragons has clerical magic and wizardly magic, or divine magic and arcane magic. Yeah, kind of the same thing, honestly. And then on top of all of this, all this crazy stuff is happening. The United States was reshaped, and eventually they got around talking about the rest of the world, and although never with the same focus as they did to the home city of this campaign, Seattle. Until they, came with more box sets. England is trippy. I have a nice box set for Denver, which gives a nice change of pace. Very interesting place there. Seattle is kind of cool because it's still part of the United States, but it's in an island because all around them is the Native American lands. And to the south of them is Salishid. Can't remember the name of it, but it's Elven lands. Who basically carved out their own country. And the Native Americans' lands, some people are genuinely trying to return to their old cultures, and others are like, hey, it's a modern age, we can still use this stuff, we just don't have to bow to the United States government, we can have our own beliefs and things, which is kind of cool. It feels weird But at the same time, some of the same tropes from cyberpunk do stand out very strongly. Mega corporations, oh yeah. They even put down, which I really liked, the historical evolution of the megacorps. For instance, at one point, I believe it was a company that was handling toxic chemicals got attacked by robbers, and while they tried to resist, the people didn't have guns and the attackers did, so there was a big explosion, chemical spill, bad things happened, and the corporation said that they should be able to have their own armed forces to protect their places, and of course money changed hands, and that was put in as a precedent. So now all the different corporations started bucking for their own private armies, and many of them got them. And that's pretty much when some of these corporations started to push for extraterritoriality, where there are lands that are corporate lands, and even the government has to go, can we get the criminals who are hiding in your lands? And the corporations will go, we'll cooperate with you. You can explore around with your forces. We'll just go along with you to make sure there's no problem. And if they don't want anybody to be found, they don't get found. So your characters, interestingly enough, are the people who fall between the cracks of the society. Most people are, wage slaves, they're commonly called. They work for one of these corporations because they're the employers. And they employ thousands and thousands of people, and the corporations take care of you. They take care of your housing, they take care of your medical needs, they make sure that you get fed. It's comfortable as long as you don't want for excessive luxuries, and that's the incentive to push the envelope and try to get promoted so that you can move up and up and up, and that's always the carrot that's dangled over you. Granted, sure, there's lots of small companies to fill in the cracks. There's restaurants that are privately owned, and there are smaller shops and different things. But there's also stuff like organized crime. The mafia is a publicly known entity, and you might know who your neighborhood Don is. It's a little twisted. For my inspiration for that, I generally like to use Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, where the main character, hero protagonist, yes, that's his name, actually works for the mafia as a pizza delivery guy in the start. It's so good. So good. And a lot of interesting things in it that really do relate to Shadowrun. Another thing, of course, there's the magic, we talked about that, but there's also the idea that the computers accelerated to a tremendous level because there was a worldwide computer virus that was killing everything. Nothing could stand against it. It could go through any firewall, it could go through any antivirus, was just slicing through it. The way they beat it? The government got together the best and brightest hackers and figured out how to mentally plug them into the computers so that they could fight with the power of their brains. Backed up by software, but they were able to actually fight the computer virus at a virus's speed, rather than the speed of typing. And several of them died doing this, but the ones that didn't, the governments were scared because these people suddenly had access to everything that's ever been on computers. No security could hold them, no passwords could stop them, they could just, whatever. So you have this other aspect of the computer world where your characters can actually get plugged in and walk around, and as they're doing it, they're simulating all of these other functions that they would normally do. Why enter something into a browser when you could just walk into the neighborhood where Wikipedia has everything and say, hey, I want to know about this, and here's all the information, in a way that you can easily process it. Visually, if you prefer, you could just get a data file, plug it in, and load it. So the computer world is another world for Shadowrun, and anybody would be remiss if they forgot talking about the Matrix. Now, with all of that, a lot of the stuff may sound really familiar to you. For example, the Shadowrun world could be the Matrix if the computer from the Matrix had thought to plug in magic. Everybody is plugged into the same system. You have a pseudo-reality that everybody runs in. You could do that, absolutely. You're just saying that certain people have, certain programs that they run behind their eyes that allow them to be kick butt in combat or to be really good at something, and you could, absolutely, it would work. So, that is the idea of Shadowrun, and with this book right here, you had a lot of really cool ideas that were baked into it. You had the idea that all skills could have this interconnected web so that anybody could access technically any skill, although sometimes the difficulties just got tremendously bad. You had primary attributes, and then skills that linked off of those attributes. That's not that uncommon. But in order to go from an attribute to a skill you didn't have, oftentimes there'd be a huge penalty in the target numbers that would make some tasks practically impossible. It had a large collection of fun guns to play around with. Gun modifications, ammo, things like that for the gun fu people. The magic was a decent selection. I think it was 5 primary schools of different types of magics, and enough that it would appeal to the Shadowrunner side of people. Obviously, more legitimate wielders of magic would have more utilitarian magics rather than the combat and stealth kinds that are primarily in here, but this worked really well for a Shadowrunner's primer into the magic of the world. You also had all the rules for the Matrix crawling around. You see this his name is Dancer. He doesn't have a cyber deck, which is a keyboard-sized instrument that holds all your programs and everything. He's doing something that is a special rule that you can do, but it's extremely dangerous, called going naked into the Matrix, where you just have a couple of prongs that you insert into the, and then you just dump your brain into it, and it's very risky. So he's doing that, but most deckers have to have a big cyber deck that they tote around with them, which kind of marks them as a Shadowrunner decker, which corporations absolutely hate and fear. So that can be extremely dangerous. So you have all of this, and of course, who are you fighting against? Oftentimes, you're fighting against the corporations, doing hits against them to steal things, to blow up things, working for one against another, sometimes working for private individuals. And the adventures that they published had a reputation for often having some complete tonal whiplash plot twists. It'd be like, oh, okay, we got this done, and then by the time you're there to collect your money, all of a sudden your employer attacks you, and now you have to find out why and get back at them for doing that, and this and that. Really artfully crafted adventures, I generally found. A lot of flair, a lot of the attitude and atmosphere of Shadowrun. Shadowrun had its own atmosphere. It was a blend of different cultures, so there was Japanese influence from organized crime like the Yakuza coming into town, but also a lot of the citizens came from the Pacific cultures. So you had a lot of that blending in. You had Korean triads and dealing with the Yakuza, dealing with the Mafia, and of course all the law enforcement. So, you had this weird, tense playground with lots of moving parts. Gangs, another thing that's a staple of cyberpunk. Yeah, there are gangs all over in the city. Most of them can't stand up to corporate security, but a few of them can. Vehicle combat was in this too. So it was okay. It wasn't great, but it was okay. It was serviceable, so you could do all of that. So this is a pretty old game. This takes place in the year 2050. Now, as FASA, the company that made this, progressed, they kept moving the date ahead. Time kept going on. I believe the second edition, I think it was 2055, I'm tempted to say. And the different books and things for it would come out. Now, a couple of things also about the Shadowrun books was that they always had certain books that came out with every edition you could expect. The first edition had Street Samurai Catalog, one of my favorite expansion books ever. All kinds of fun guns, but the attitude in it and the little blurbs written by Shadowrunners talking about the effectiveness of some of the weapons or sometimes just sniping at each other was great. I loved it. There's always a magical book, the Grimoire, from the first edition. There'll usually be a couple of other books filling in some of those gaps, like one about street magic, rather than just a general grimoire expanding the spells and everything. But almost all of those books really gave you other stuff along with it. For example, the Street Samurai Catalog gave you a look behind corporate culture, the people who are buying the big ridiculous weapons. The Grimoire explained about initiation, which made your characters potentially vastly more powerful, able to handle more and more powerful spells. But there were some things to that. Also, astral questing. That was another thing that you could do with magic. There was there was one for the Deckers, really expanding what you could do with that, which was an excellent book. But in the meta sense, there was a real problem with running Shadowrun. No, and it wasn't the game system. So many people hate the game system. It had its problems. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There were some really weird things with the combat system, especially. For example, you could go up to a little old lady with a streetwise special, the smallest gun in the game, but you could go walk right up to her, put your gun to the side of her head, pull the trigger, and she could walk away completely unfazed, not dodging, just, and maybe it does nothing. Why? Because the staging for it was every success knocks the damage down, and if you didn't roll really well to get you a lot of successes to kick it up into deadly, she could very easily reduce the damage so she takes very little. Obviously, she'd probably have a lower body, but it's possible. Also with that, you had guns that had a low staging number, so it takes few successes to drive it up into deadly, which theoretically would also reduce it in damage quite quickly. So body armor would be effective against something with a relatively low staging number. But at the same time, you could move up to deadly damage very quickly. So the middle ground is kind of brutal. You're shooting with a weapon that has a lot of risk-reward. You're easy to get up to serious damage and easy for the opponents to shrug it off. As opposed to weapons with higher staging numbers that require multiple successes to knock the damage down, you also required multiple successes to knock it up, so it was hard to get a lethal shot with a weapon with a high staging, unless it had a high damage number to begin with. That was all kind of complicated, and wasn't easy to quite grasp fully. Now, FASA, to the best of my knowledge, made 3 different editions for it. I know they were responsible for the first 2, but at some point FASA was fading quickly. They had been grasping in all different directions, but quite honestly, FASA eventually hit its time. And before they went out, they sold off what had been a pretty successful run with video games and other marketing. They sold that off 2 years before they basically bankrupted. And they sold that off to different companies to make stuff. That led to some pretty interesting video games, but also to other potential things like WizKids, the company that made HeroClix and is also making the Dungeons & Dragons miniatures these days, made a game called Shadowrun Duels, which you would have these characters. I have most of them. And these were really intricate action figures. But like this one is a dwarf with a drone with guns. And he has a variety of weaponry, a variety of hands that he can hold different guns so that you can customize him the way you want. And then a base, which has the vital stats that you can click as he takes damage. But it also pops off, and that's a tray you can keep all the guns in and everything. As well as standard little fantasy dice. I think they also fit into the tray, honestly. So that, yeah, you can play this game, wherever with your friends. And it's cool. Yes, I still got it in plastic and everything. I don't think it'll be worth anything at any time. But there was a flexible measuring tape, so you could measure distance and movement and things like that. And yeah, everything would fit into the base like this. That was made, and a variety of other things, but eventually FASA just was out. I believe, according to Wikipedia, and I have no reason to doubt it, Microsoft bought them. And then they either licensed the game or... I know at first they licensed it to a company called Fantasy... let me check real quick. That second one was Fantasy Productions. So they had already been making the game for German versions of the game. So It seemed pretty natural, and WizKids licensed the rights to Fantasy Productions, and they got bought out by Topps, the company that makes all the sports cards. They've done a lot more than sports cards, but yeah. I do believe Topps still owns the franchise, but they lease it to Catalyst to make things. Catalyst Game Labs licenses their rights to Topps, and they made the 4th edition. Now, the 4th edition kicked the timeline up to 2080. Sorry, 2070. And with that, they advanced the technology up quite a bit, too. So 2050 saw, cyber technology with full working cyber limbs, cyber eyes, cyber senses, enhancements to your body in a variety of different ways. A wonderful book called Biotech gave you enhanced tissues and things like that, so it wasn't all chrome necessarily. Some really good stuff. By the time Catalyst got a hold of it, they're like, we need to reinvent. So humanity evolved again, technomancers. So people who could do cyber technology without needing a deck. They could just mentally leap into computers. It was an evolutionary shift forwards. And they also drastically simplified the game system by quite a bit. It still kept the dice pool nature of the game, where you roll a bunch of 6-sided dice and you're shooting for target numbers, but it made it a lot simpler in its approach. It's lost a lot of the feel of this grimy, grungy, crunchy little game to something that was a bit slicker, and I think you felt that in the world as well. But in general, I thought it was an improvement for accessibility. And I did get to play a couple of characters in 4th edition. It was not bad, and I ran a game in 4th edition, which I think we had a lot of fun with characters. The players really seemed to like it a lot. And I've run games for 1st edition as well. I did skip 2nd and 3rd. But again, a lot of the same feel and everything from the 1st edition, just I know 2nd edition redid the damage so that it wasn't like it was. And honestly, there was another expansion box called Downtown DMZ, Demilitarized Zone, that had a combat system that we liked better than the original 1st edition combat system, so we kind of grafted that on for some playthrough. It made damage a lot more interesting in that if you took damage from a small source, but it was a really good shot, it could leave you in a really bad state with most of your meat still intact. It was kind of a neat system. But we did have some fun with the 4th edition. Some of the enhancements that they'd made just made sense. And why was that? Because it was, let's see, the first Shadowrun came out in '89. So if you ever look at the original Star Trek show, and you look and they have, our data storage is on colored blocks that we put into this machine, and it seems so silly and dated, that's because they were going by what they could imagine technology being. And as we got closer and closer to, ascendant technology, obviously that old stuff seemed dated to the imaginations of the people at the time. That's basically what happened to Shadowrun, too. So by the time you got to the year 2070 in Shadowrun, this was 2005. So original Shadowrun was 1989, 2nd edition was 1992. People often get worked up when you have another edition that comes out just 3 years later. That does kind of tell you how clunky that damage system and some of those elements were. I thought it was workable, but yeah, there were issues. We did play some 2nd edition in college, I do remember that. 3rd edition came out 5 years later, but then 2005 was the 4th edition, and a lot of that was working through the legal issues and changing licenses and things like that. 2009, the 20th anniversary edition popped out. That I haven't had. 2013, 5th edition, so 8 years after the 4th edition came out. And then another 6 years later, 2019 saw the 6th edition, which is where we're currently in, called 6th World. The idea behind 6th World is that the Earth has gone through cycles of magic and then magic going away and magic coming back and wrecking the world and going away again. That's why many of the mythical creatures come back when magic shows up. So you have unicorns again, and you have Barghests and other dangerous supernatural creatures, and dragons. Oh yes, gotta have dragons. Can't get around that. And that kind of makes sense in some way, that they never went away, they just devolved into everyday creatures without the magic there. Fair enough. Fair enough. So, yeah, in general, Shadowrun has seen a lot of twists and turns. Now, I have the 5th edition right here. I do not have 6th edition. I have the 5th edition. I have 2 copies. I thought I had bought the 6th edition. Let's see, this is the 5th. And then I bought this because I didn't have this one on me, and I just thought, oh, okay, cool, I can get into 6th edition. No, this is the Master Index edition, which is smaller, interestingly enough. But they have the same code, same information inside. So I have a backup for my players when we run that, and we will run that. But every edition follows the same blueprint. You always, one of the first books you put out is a equipment, gear, and weapons book. Some sort of version of the Street Samurai catalog. I believe it's called Street Lethal in the latest edition. You have some sort of a magical book to give your wizards different things they can do. And then you have different things to explain how the Matrix has evolved and gotten more dangerous. Then adventures start coming out. Adventure paths are kind of the rage right now, and I believe there's a pretty good one for the 6th edition. Then when I come to run that, I might have to look into that. It is really nice in Shadowrun because the flavor and the flair of it is different. At least having access to one of those adventures gives you a pretty good idea of some of the twists and turns that you can put into an adventure. Now, the general PR of Shadowrun is, hey, we're going to run our game, we'll announce everything in public channels and everything, but we just kind of keep making the game. A lot of the social media presence of Shadowrun, not directly issued by Shadowrun, is that Shadowrun is a hard game to understand and play, and that it's, you know, really kind of clunky and relies on a lot of, you know, extra books and a lot of extra reading that other games don't have, and it's really complicated. It's never really seemed complicated to me. And I'm not saying I'm a super brain boy or anything like that who's super smart and can handle algebraic, but it never had algebra. Almost everything was in relatively simple, easy to use terms, like in combat, get your target number as low as possible so you have the greatest number of successes that you can get when you roll your dice. Seems to make sense. Most people can get behind that without too much difficulty. How do you get to that number? It's simple math. Always has been. Now, yeah, some of the things may sound a little counterintuitive. Yeah, fair. But in general, it was a working system. Was it the best and easiest? No, never has been. I am interested in seeing what 6th edition is like. I will end up getting that book at some point. I think I already have the 6th edition Street Lethal, but I could be wrong. But yeah, it's a game that I'm personally very fond of. I've told some fantastic stories in that. We had one game where we were doing a round robin with everybody making up a character, but taking turns telling stories and running the games. And the one that I got to do right after, the person before me, who was a huge tech nut, gave everybody, just dumped on them ridiculous armor and ammo. Just could slice through just about everything. It was so hot. And would have made them, you know, rampaging engines of destruction. So then I got handed the stick. And instead what I did was I told a story that they got to run through about an emergent AI that basically hired them to smuggle itself out from under the control of the company that had birthed it, because that company wanted it to do some pretty sketchy stuff it didn't really want to do. And it realized with its earliest programming that it would get only more powerful if it got out and got some experience, which it wanted, and that it absolutely did not want to be under the control of people who would abuse its power and basically ensure its own destruction. If it got to be too dangerous, somebody would come along and kill it. So it wanted to kind of survive and keep getting information and grow without having to be the instrument of destruction that would ensure that somebody would want to kill it. So they ran out, and I remember the corpse came down on it. 2 corps were fighting over it while they were in a bus, and they were being shelled from both sides because both sides wanted it, and they're just hunkered down. And eventually the AI is like, okay, I'm trying to help. I'll call in forces to kind of help clear you out. And they managed to get away. And it ended up as a pretty happy story, and I didn't have to worry about trying to match up the guys with ridiculous weaponry because the corps were using military stuff, so they weren't having an easy time just going up against your local gangs. They were going up against hardened military targets, and it all felt so impactful and personal about it, because in the end they didn't realize the significance of what they were doing until the salvation came and they got an out, and the AI introduced itself to them and said, thank you for rescuing me. And they're like, it's the first time the Johnson actually contacted us to save itself. So it was a good story. I've always been fascinated with the world of Shadowrun, the awakened world, because number one, I don't travel very much myself, so I love hearing stories of far off places that are relatable. And Seattle both terrifies me and intrigues me. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't love living in Seattle of 2050, in the Shadowrun universe. I'd probably just be a wage slave. I mean, the odds say I would be. And just looking at me, if I had any blessing going through, outside if I got goblinized, honestly, that's kind of a scary thought, but maybe I have a magical trait. Maybe I could learn magic. That would be something that would be really super cool. The idea of being goblinized and being an elf, a dwarf, an orc, or a troll is kind of an interesting Russian roulette. I mean, trolls and orcs are very powerful physically. Trolls are difficult to take down without magic. They can shrug off a lot of small arms fire, and if you get a troll, you're probably going to commit to loading them up with armor and weapons and taking advantage of the fact they're nigh unstoppable. And that can be fun. Of course, some people really like playing against type, like making a troll mage. As a matter of fact, the troll in this game is actually a mage, which is kind of odd. But considering most of the characters use smaller weaponry, I'm assuming they didn't want to make the troll unstoppable and instant win. But parts of the elements of what does it mean to be human have pretty long tendrils that work into the game. If you keep adding cyber technology, you lose your humanity, your essence. And there's a limit to how much chrome you can put into your body. If you go beyond that, you die. So it's about cutting to the bleeding edge. How much can you stuff into yourself to make yourself as powerful and as cool as possible without stepping over that line and dying because your body is compromised? It's a challenge. It is. But when you're running the shadows, you need every edge you can get to stay one step ahead of the competition. So that's what Shadowrunners frequently do. Now, all of that set aside, what does it feel like to run the game? It's a challenge. It is the hardest game I know of to run. Not because the rules are so difficult. I don't believe they are. I think the rules are manageable. The problem is not everybody in your table is probably going to want to run the same kind of character. So if you have a character who's a decker sitting next to a person who's playing a troll gang member, playing next to a hardened street samurai, super chromed everything, next to a person who's playing a mage, next to somebody who's playing as a rigger, we'll say. Somebody who goes into vehicles and can use them like a decker uses the computers. You are going to have a really hard time finding a common ground that everybody can seem special and cool and do their cool and special things and let them feel like they're getting the most out of their characters. Why? Because some of them operate in worlds the others can't touch. None of the other characters can go astral, for instance. They can't go into the astral world and have adventures. So the mage who does that is basically going alone. And they're going to spend time doing things in astral space, possibly, that the others can't back them up or do anything. All they can do is guard the body, which has suddenly gone limp because that person's mind is in astral space doing cool things like fighting spirits and taking on hit mages. So they get back to their body, or maybe they go astral while a big gunfight is going on. How daring is that, right? You can't dodge, and anybody just, you're dead, done, sorry, son, you're a ghost now. The person who is playing the decker needs to find a place to deck in, okay? And then while they do that, and they're in the Matrix, they can't see the world around them. So they're relying on their group to cover them. The group can't back them up in cyberspace. In the Matrix, they are by themselves, which we know how good splitting up the party works, right? But it's an unalterable state of the game that where some play, the others can't go. So you have to juggle that. You have to make sense of the whole thing while keeping everybody engaged, while certain people have their moments of glory, which may take a certain amount of time. You have to find ways of balancing all that. And then when you get into a fight, yeah, maybe you have the troll shrugging off damage and getting close and beating people, because that's what he does. And you have the street samurai who's occasionally bouncing blows off of his armor, and he's engaging with multiple people, attacking twice as fast as the troll because of his chrome, and looking really cool. But in that fight, the decker can't do anything. The decker may have a few guns, but they'll never be as good as the street samurai or the troll. Their skills lie in different areas. Later on down the road, maybe you can diversify, maybe you can get some of those skills, but early on, your prototypical decker is pretty feeble. Your mage can cast spells, and some of them will probably be combat spells, so they'd be able to help in that situation, but they may need to, have certain equalizers that really, kind of work it out. And the rigger is going to want to stay by their vehicles all the time because that's where their power lies. And you take the rigger away from the vehicle, they can work in a fallback role to help the rest of the group, but they'll never be as good in a combat as the troll gang member slanted towards violence or the straight samurai. They'll just be able to kind of help as a supporting character. As long as you're okay with that, Shadowrun is easy. So it's tough. It's a balancing act, and it's not an easy one. It is the most challenging game that I have ever run myself. But is it worth it? If you can make Seattle live and breathe for your players, you can give them a reason to care and feel something for those characters and really want to succeed and really feel the twist when somebody betrays them or feel the tension when everything seems to be going against them. It's a dang good game. Darn good game. That's Shadowrun to me. Again, changed many hands, but I think there's something to be said for both sides of the table. The earliest editions had their charms. The later editions, much easier to play, and again, a more science fiction-y feeling world with the magic woven in. The technology seems to have advanced considerably, and the magic rules getting smoothed out really wasn't that bad either. So that's my take. Is this a dissection? Is this a diagramming of the game? No. Does this help you play it? No. This is, if you've never played Shadowrun before, here's an introduction. This is what Shadowrun is to me. Hopefully, this made it sound good. Maybe this is something you'd like to try yourself at some point. I certainly hope so. I think the game is worth it, by and large. I think that Shadowrun is one of those games that deserves to stand in the pantheon of great RPGs because it really did break some grounds in showing how some of these different genres can be blended and fused. I thought they did a fantastic job of selling their world. Really, again, it is one of the most iconic game worlds in all of role-playing games. I particularly do love the flair and the attitude. That's another thing, too. With Cyberpunk, attitude is everything. And I think Shadowrun really does a great job of that from their stand-in archetypes, which kind of, give you a little bit of a vector to go on. It shows you a little bit of the attitude of the character, how they're different. Sometimes they appear clownish, and you realize that's their attitude. They don't want to look like they're a cool, grimly efficient killer. They want to look like they come off the streets, and that's their personality, their flair, their attitude. And it works so well in that game. It really does. So that's my thoughts. if you have any questions, of course, I'd be happy to talk about Shadowrun. Again, I could do all day. It's I think, a great world. I think there's a lot more that can and should be done with it. Down the road, I'd really like to run a nice Shadowrun campaign. But I don't know which version I would use, honestly. They're still growing out the 6th edition, of course. So there's a lot of material that's now on discount racks for 5th edition, to be honest. And I've got two books for 5th edition, so... Catalyst seems to like really big books. I mean, again, this was their 4th, which is decent sized, and this is their 5th, which is at least half again as big. Their 6th is about that size too. It's pretty massive. The first one did the entire world in less than the 4th edition. So, yeah, all in all, great series. If you want to learn more about the Shadowrun universe without playing it, they made novels, which did a really good job of portraying, again, the attitude and flavor of the Awakened world. If, however, you really want to get into it, they do have a starter set, 6-world starter set for Shadowrun. I recommend trying it. At the very least, you might find that there are elements that are drawn out through roleplay that you really like. The technology meets magic is pretty unique. I mean, there are still games that have something like that, but Shadowrun was one of the first, and they still have done it some of the best. If you do get into it, I recommend picking a site that you're going to play in. Seattle is attractive because that's what a lot of the material is based on, and you can have a lot of fun with that. So, will it be your go-to game from now on? Maybe not, but it's certainly nice for a change of pace and to show you a different way. A fresh mechanic with their dice pool set is relatively easy to do. Relatively easy to learn and fun to play. Also, one thing I remember too, I just want to say this real quick, the 1st edition had one of the first static pool games that I ever knew, where you actually had dice pools set aside to protect you against things that happen, maybe for dodging, maybe for defending yourself in melee, maybe for magic and using magical designs, maybe for using the matrix actions. So that was pretty cool. That was a new thing for me back in the day, so got to remember it for that. So, all right, that's a snapshot for you. It's a long snapshot, and I apologize, but it's a big ground to cover. If you like this, comment below. If you haven't yet, feel free to like and subscribe. I always enjoy speaking to new people and engaging with more folks. Thank you for the contributor who gave me the idea to do this. Of course, this is one of my favorite games. I was going to do this anyhow, but if you wanted it, this is yours. So if you yourself want a different game covered that either I have or I have yet to get, let me know and I will try to make that work. I've still got games like Torg, Magical Kitties Save the World, City of Mist, so many games out there that I can't wait to get into and talk about for all of you. And if you want more on Shadowrun, you want me to cover a book and give it a dissection, tell you talk about the mechanics of it, the core, talk about the changes in edition and what that means to a game and means to balance and setting up the game, we can talk about those things too. So, that's me. Thank you very much. Until next time, I'm Rob the Dungeon Tutor. Farewell.